think this is the second. And the first was called Coraline. Coraline was meant to have been a short story that I wrote for my daughter Holly. And then it just sort of kept going. And by the time I finished it, it was 10 years later. And I had more daughters, well, one more daughter when I started. And it was a book. This began because I missed my wife. I was in Florida, where I'd gone to get away from the world and do some writing. And one reason I decided to get away from the world and do some writing was that my wife Amanda had gone to Melbourne, Australia to make a record. And she was very single-minded about making her record. I kind of figured that when she went away to make a record, it would be sort of like, you know, in the past when we conducted the more long-distancey bits of our relationship, where I'd phone her at night, so she'd phone me and we'd catch up, and there'd be long emails or photographs or occasional Skypeage. And instead, if I was lucky, I would get a text message saying, "Love you, making an album." Album going well. Wrote songs today. We'll text again in 3 days' time. And I missed her. I missed her a lot. So I thought, I will write a short story for my wife. That's what I'll do. And it'll just be like a postcard. It'll be something that I'll send her from Florida to Australia, and she'll read it, and she'll think of me. And Amanda doesn't actually like fantasy very much. Do not know why she married me, because that's what I do. But she doesn't really like fantasy, but she likes me. And she likes honest stories, and she likes things with feelings in. And I thought, I could do that. How hard can it be to do feelings? And I thought, I'll tell... There was a story that I wanted to tell for a long time that was the story of... It was something that happened when I was 7 years old, but I didn't actually find out that it had happened until I was in my early 40s, where our lodger had been gambling at the casino in Brighton, and he gambled his money, and he gambled all the money that his friends had given him to sneak out of South Africa and bank for them. And having lost it all, he came back in the small hours of the morning, stole our little Mini, drove it to the bottom of the lane, and killed himself. And I never knew about this. I didn't discover it until I was in my 40s, talking to my dad about cars. And I said, "Whatever happened to that little white Mini we used to have? I like that." And he said, "Oh. Have I never told you?" And I said, "No, you have never told me." So he did. And that fascinated me, and it fascinated me mostly because I kept thinking, well, there was me going through my childhood thinking, exciting things only ever happen in books. Big things only ever happen in books. And there was this big thing that happened, and I never even knew about it. So I thought I'd put it in my book. And I had a family living in my head. The family had been living in my head since I was about 8 or 9, when I discovered that the farm at the end of our lane was actually mentioned in the Doomsday Book, the book that William the Conqueror put together of all of the properties in England when he invaded in 1066. And I didn't think this would have been some kind of ancient peasant hovel. I thought, well, obviously this nice red brick farmhouse has been there for 1,000 years, because I was 8. That was how you think. And then I thought, I wonder if the same family has been living there for 1,000 years. And that sort of took root in my head, and by the time I was about 12, they were definitely called the Hempstock family. And seeing that I never actually got to write a story set at the end of my lane, I never got to mention them. So occasionally I would take distant relatives of them, of the Hempstocks, and I would put them in other books. So Daisy Hempstock shows up in Stardust, and Liza Hempstock shows up in the Graveyard Book. But now, I thought, well, I can actually do a story set at the end of my lane. And I should actually have the Hempstocks in there. So that, and the suicide, was the starting point for what I was sure was going to be a short story. And then, after a few weeks, it was something I was sure was going to be a novelette. And then after a couple of weeks, it was something I was pretty sure was a novella, but probably not a long novella. And then I wrote an email to my editor saying that I appear to be writing a long novella. I'm not quite sure what we'll do with it. And then I finished the book. I typed it all up. I did a word count. And I sent another email off saying I appear to have written a novel. I'm very sorry.